Hey there, students. In your European history class, no doubt you have discussed civic humanism in the context of the Renaissance. Now, I've done some other videos on civic humanism. I've got a video on Machiavelli's The Prince, but I want to delve deeper into civic humanism, this part of humanism, this variant that's really focused on training young men for political life. And this idea that the classics, the ancient literature of ancient Greece and Rome, Greek, Roman, and biblical literature, that this sort of program gets someone ready for public service and makes them either an effective prince, an effective ruler, or an effective courtier, somebody who is serving the ruler. So as far as that goes, let's go ahead and get into Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. And I need to thank MG for giving me that Italian pronunciation a few years ago, Castiglione. Now, you can say, if it's a written test, if it makes you feel better to say Castiglione, then by all means, Castiglione. But don't tell somebody that, you'll sound like an idiot, okay? But in the course of the High Renaissance, Castiglione wrote The Book of the Courtier, which is a book basically telling someone how to be a gentleman, a Renaissance man, somebody who is going to excel not as a prince, but as someone who has the ear of a prince, which really, when it comes down to it, a lot of times the kingmakers are more important than the kings themselves. Kings don't do a lot of their own thinking, neither do princes. They listen to advisors. So how do you get to be an advisor? Because you want to be respected. And speaking of people I respect, I want to give a quick shout out to Paul Stewie and his class in Kansas. They have been good to me over the years, and thank you so much. So let's go ahead and go into it, okay? So first of all, as far as this goes, Castiglione says that he's not doing this in a set format. When we think about chapter books, this chapter addresses this, then this, and we go in a very linear fashion. He says, no, I'm actually not going to go in a fixed order, that I'm going to put this as a conversation. I've got characters who are going to talk to each other. And he says here, this is after the fashion of many ancient writers. So when we're thinking about humanism and the fascination with ancient Greece and Rome and the desire to imitate them, he's doing that here in his format. Remember, when we read Plato, we see a lot of dialogues. It's always these characters that are talking, and this is more how the ancients think. This is not just a situation as far as, okay, well, here is an ordered thing, but let's learn through a conversation. So I see here the main character here is Count Ludovico, then we've got Lord Caspar, and maybe that's Caspar, I don't know, good thing it's a written test, right? And then there's a Lady Duchess in there later on. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, what is a courtier? Okay, a courtier is the person who is serving in a prince's court, in the court of a ruler. And what is it that he needs? Okay, so first of all, he says that the courtier, his true profession, the principal and true profession of the courtier ought to be that of arms. And he be known to others as bold and strong and loyal to whoever he serves. So as far as that goes, this person is first of all a warrior before anything else. This person does not have a reputation for cowardice. This person has a reputation for unconquered courage and perfect loyalty. Now, he says here that it's not so important that this fighting man necessarily be a great military commander, but this is someone who has these martial virtues of courage and loyalty. That when you think about it, when you think about athletic teams, someone who's coaching the team is typically not the person who was the best player, but they are coaching, okay? So as far as this goes, you don't necessarily need to be a great general, but you need to be someone who's known as a virtuous fighting man. And that your courage is real, that it's not just something that's for show, that you're showing this courage when you're not looking. He says something about this, that people have what appears to be courage sometimes. And I think that one of the things that Castiglione gets onto is this idea of being real, okay? This idea of being someone who's not seen as fake, someone who is the real deal. Because he writes here that where there are many spectators, some men are to be found who although their hearts be dead within them, yet moved by shame or by the presence of others, press forward almost with their eyes shut. But that's not what we're looking for here in a courtier. We're looking for loyalty and courage. Now, the other thing here, though, is that the courtier has to go further than just being a fighting man. The courtier has to also be well-rounded. We think about this idea of the Renaissance man, somebody who not only is a fighter, but also someone who is cultured, someone who is educated and well-rounded. Now, one of the things that you see in this reading is kind of a dialogue between the Italians and the French. As an Italian, Castiglione is writing in the High Renaissance in 1513, and the French really have not adopted humanistic studies. And there's this idea that if we adopt humanistic studies, it's going to water down our fighting spirit, okay? So as far as it goes, he mentions a guy who was asked by a woman to dance, and he said, "No, I don't need to dance. I don't need to dance. I don't need to listen to music. I'm just a fighting man because I'm not going to water down my manhood here as far as, dancing. Who does that?" Well, Castiglione says that that's what a Renaissance man does. That's what the courtier does. And so he says here that this stuff's none of my business. I'm just a fighter. Well, what the woman says to him is, well, what you might as well do, why don't we just put oil on you since you're not fighting right now? We'll put oil on you and we'll put you in a box and put you in a closet just like we would do with a suit of armor. Because when you're not fighting, then you are useless. And that is what Castiglione is trying to avoid. No one likes a one-trick pony. Someone should be cultured and well-rounded. And let's remember here, now this is of course up to your individual judgment, how valuable this is for us today, how much we can learn from this, because the whole perspective of humanistic studies is that this body of classical literature, the Greek, Roman, and biblical literature, that they give us everything that we need, because while circumstances change, people don't change. And if we think about this today, if you were to ask a woman, would you rather have a man who is athletic or not athletic? Then she's going to say athletic. But then when you start to ask, well, what about a guy who's super athletic, but he's an idiot and he doesn't know anything about books, he's not smart? And a lot of, most women are going to say, I would like a man that's well-rounded. Now, of course, men may not feel the same way, which is something we'll address when we address the part where he talks about how to be a Renaissance lady. But he says here that, know the situation, fit in wherever you are. Well, my daughter just showed up right there, and oh my goodness, hey there, that scared me, but glad you're here. Mwah. All right. Mwah. Okay, thank you for coming by. Wow, that really gave me a little jump there. All right, so as far as that goes, around your enemies, be bold, be stern, be first to the fight. But when you're around your friends, be gentle, modest, reserved. Show that you can wear different hats depending on the situation. And also he says that avoid impudent self-praise, as far as he says here, that you want to avoid that. Now, this is where the dialogue element comes in, okay? Because then Lord Caspar says, well, wait, isn't it okay to praise yourself sometimes? And he says here, whoever carries weight seldom fails to praise himself. As far as if you never praise yourself, how's anybody going to know that you're anything special? And this is where the dialogue part of it is great. And also, let's think about the fusion of Christian and classical ideals. Because if we think about in the Bible, for example, pride is something that is not seen as a virtue. That's, you should always try to be humble in all things. Whereas when you look at the classical tradition, the Greeks and the Romans, it's okay to praise yourself. It's okay to brag as long as you've accomplished something and you're not taking it too far. It is okay to be honest about what you've accomplished, and people actually appreciate that. You think about when you post on Instagram where you accomplish something and you're proud of yourself, and people typically like those photos. They like your accomplishments. Now, if it's somebody, you all know that person who, no matter what the topic of conversation, they tie it back to someone or some time. They tie it back to some time that they accomplished something, and they can take something that's completely irrelevant and they make it about how great they are and what they've accomplished, and people get tired of that. Okay, so what the Count says is, he says, we surely ought not to form a bad opinion of a brave man who praises himself modestly. So as far as that, do you deserve self-praise? Then go for it, but don't take it too far. Show this moderation, which is something that we see in both his ideal man and ideal woman. So then the Count also goes into the Renaissance education. He takes another jab at the French, who have not seen this as necessary. A fighting man is a fighting man. And that's another thing that you want to pay attention to as well, how the Renaissance has an effect on masculinity and femininity. And so, depending on whether you feel that those things are socially constructed or whether they are strictly biological or somewhere in between, it's an interesting case study here as we see that the Italians are starting to pick up on these humanistic studies. And so he says that a man of letters, this man is superior to someone who is not educated. That letters have indeed been granted by God to men as a crowning gift. And he mentions as well, because a lot of people, when you're in high school especially, you're thinking, I don't want to be seen as a nerd, right? But when it comes down to it, that the most successful military commanders of antiquity were nerds, okay? Like, when you think about this, first of all, Alexander the Great, he had a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. He slept with a copy of Homer. He also slept with a dagger, just in case somebody was trying to come in at night. So that was the thing. Alexander the Great is kind of like this, he's this classical icon of this sort of mentality that somebody should seek to be a warrior, but also someone who is educated. In fact, Alexander the Great once said that he would rather surpass other people in the knowledge of what is excellent than in the extent of his dominions. Now remember, this is a guy that was Aristotle's pupil. We always hear about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but there's also Alexander the Great. And so as far as that, when we look at Julius Caesar, anytime he went on campaigns, he published an account. So he was someone who was a man of letters. Scipio Africanus was also someone who was highly educated. So if we're looking at those examples from classical antiquity, we're seeing here that yes, you should try to be someone who is both educated and also fierce. And so, the French, reading a book won't hurt you, okay? It makes you stronger. It doesn't make you weaker. And if you were to ask people about generally the type of person that they find attractive, it's not the one-trick pony. It's the person who is showing that, look, I can be athletic, or I can have fighting skills, but I can also carry on a conversation, and I can talk about books and that sort of thing. So the other thing about that is, when you think about it, why is it that the commanders of classical antiquity were also men of letters? And this is something else that you think about, that when we read history, we think, wow, I want to be like that person. I want to have that kind of glory. There's a story of Julius Caesar when he was in his early 30s that he wept. And the reason that he wept was because when Alexander the Great was my age, he'd taken over the world. And what have I done? Really, when you turn like 33, 34, that really starts to hit you. That when I was that age, Alexander the Great, or when he was that age, right? Alexander the Great, he'd done all kinds of stuff. What have I done? Now, Julius Caesar didn't get a chance to shine until his 40s, but shine he did. And if he'd never had that example, if he hadn't been someone who studied the classics and who looked up to Alexander the Great, then perhaps he would have never achieved the glory that he did, and he would have we would have forgotten his name. You think about Napoleon crossing the Alps, that iconic painting where you see in the corner that he's got his heroes, Hannibal, Charlemagne, and they're sitting there as far as these are people I look up to. These are people that I want to be like. And that's what made Napoleon a great conqueror. Napoleon wasn't someone who was ignorant. And so what kind of education should this Renaissance man have? Well, this Renaissance man the courtier should receive a classical education. Now it says here that I would have the courtier be more than passably accomplished in letters. So not just an average student, not necessarily the best student, but a good student. And when it comes down to it, Latin and Greek, literature, philosophy, poetry, and history. And you should learn how to write, especially in the vernacular, because the ladies like that. Now remember that during the Renaissance, women typically were not taught Latin and Greek. So if you wanted to write a poem for your lady friend, you would write this in the vernacular. And so you want to learn how to write at least pretty good poetry. You don't want to be terrible at it. Now, if somebody is into you, they're not going to demand that it be William Blake or Shakespeare or something like that. But it shouldn't be terrible, right? Because that's insulting to her. Now, he notes as well that not everybody's going to be a great writer. So as far as that goes, you may not be a great writer, but at least you understand the process of writing, and that will give you the ability to judge the writing of others. You can't really tell if somebody's a genius if you have never tried this yourself. And so even the act of writing, if you never become a great writer, you're still going to be able to see that person is a genius. And again, I go back to that example that typically people who are great coaches or people who played the game, they might not have been the best, but they understand the game. And so as far as that goes, studies, he says, will give you confidence. Now, when we talk about confidence, this is very important because we want to separate this from arrogance, okay? Because he says, and this really echoes of Socrates, he should keep from falsely persuading himself that he knows that which he does not know. And when we think about that someone who is educated, and that's the thing, you get a little bit of education, you think, oh, look at me, I'm educated, but when you get a lot of education, you start thinking there is so much I don't know. The more that I learn about history, the more that I realize, wow, there's really a lot that I still need to learn. There's so much out there. So don't let your education make you arrogant. Know who you are. That's really the most important thing here. And that's going to make someone confident, truly confident, not to the point of being arrogant. And finally, in this last part of the excerpt, which is available on my website, and I'll try to remember to put this in the description as well so you can look at it, but he says, beware of flatterers and don't become one. Now, people are susceptible to flattery, and again, this is about playing the long game. Just like, don't be a person of showy courage, be a person of real courage. And so as far as that goes, flatterers will get somewhere quickly, but eventually they're going to be exposed as fake. And so if you get a reputation as someone who will speak the truth, someone who will give your honest opinion, you think about the story about the emperor's new clothes. The person who had the emperor's respect was this young girl who said, the emperor has no clothes. Everybody else was afraid to tell him. And at first, he didn't really notice, but then he realized, thank you for your honesty. So again, we see this idea of being a loyal friend, an honest friend, someone who is educated and someone who has fighting spirit. And personally, I think that there is a lot here that can reach us even now in the 21st century. Because again, we are all human beings, and that is the whole idea of Renaissance education and classical studies, and especially in preparing for politics, for a political career. Now, if you're going to be an engineer or a physicist, maybe not as important, but if you want to be someone who leads people, reading the classics and reading some of this Renaissance literature and some of these Renaissance guidebooks, I think can be very effective for you. So that is just a quick introduction to Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. Thank y'all so much for watching, and remember that I've got other videos on history and philosophy. If you subscribe to my channel, hopefully you already are. So take a look at some other stuff, and thank you for watching. It's always a pleasure.